Hello everybody, it's me, Player Negative, and today we are going to talk about the worst era of Sonic. So this is going to be my last video covering Sonic's entire explicit eras of games and their simplistic sense of the plot. But it's worth addressing before we get into the games that I have to explain a lot of issues I've glossed over. Specifically, the mischaracterization of Sonic's entire extended cast. You see, unlike other pieces of media, Sonic has one weird aspect about it that a lot of people wouldn't genuinely think that much about. People value the extended cast over the main character, which isn't inherently a bad thing, and I'm not saying that Sonic doesn't matter to the overall equation. He's the main character. Of course he matters. It's just that, well, the extended cast matters just as more, if not the same, because they build the world and they add more layers to Sonic as a character and show off various aspects of who he is in certain scenarios. Now, for the sake of your sanity and for the sake of multiple other reasons I'm not going to get to, I'm only going to be talking about a handful of characters because there is absolutely no way I am going to cover the entire cast that is spanned over 35 years. And some of it isn't even canon. So we're only counting a small cast here that we're going to count to explain the overall problem. And those characters, to put it bluntly, are gonna be the main trio and Shadow, because honestly they matter the most out of most of the extended cast, as well as someone else such as well as Amy, which isn't a lot, but it will matter. So and before you say anything, we're only counting the games. The movies are its own adaptation and characterization, and the comics aren't canon half the time. IDW is the exception. And before you say anything, we, under no circumstances, are counting that monstrosity. Because no one wants to talk about this, and nobody likes it. And I unanimously agree with that statement. So first, let's talk about the main trio, since they're the most important, with Sonic being the most obvious choice. For the two guys who don't know, Sonic's characterization up until the 2010s wasn't self-deprecating, and while we are going to get into that, let's just explain how it's meant to be. You see, Sonic as a character actually has a lot more to him than what people think he is. The character is both optimistic, but knows when to get serious when the time is tough. He's a character who displays great sympathy with other people and shows a sense of change and progression that he inspires in people. He's sincere, and while he can crack a joke in certain times, it never takes away the earnestness of who he is as a person. No matter what the odds say against him or how people say the norm is, he always rejects that because he believes in a sense of freedom. He believes in being as free as the wind, which is why he was dubbed the Knight of the Wind in Sonic and the Black Knight, and he also believes his enemies deserve a second chance. It's kind of like a mid-section between Spider-Man's responsibility and cracking jokes and Superman's virtuous sense of truth, hope, and justice. It's honestly a nice middle ground, and while the movies take it in a different direction, it's good to see this being portrayed. A good example of his inspiration for change is Tails. In the first game, he was reduced more than nothing but a Player 2 emulation and a simple sidekick. However, come Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, the game completely changed his personality. Now, why his infatuating hyperfixation for tech was still the same, he had a massive insecurity he was fighting with in the first adventure game, that he's nothing more than a sidekick who's not worthy to stand by Sonic, which we all know not to be true, but he still doubts in that concept. So far, throughout the game, he progresses by showing his sense of ingenuity and why he does try to act like Sonic, he eventually comes to the conclusion, after understanding that he does not share the same sense of ingenuity and hyperfixation with tech, that he comes to the conclusion that the two are different, and why he never will become Sonic, he's okay with that. The last part in his storyline in Adventure 1 is that he fights Eggman, a threat that he never learned to deal with on his own without Sonic, and completely beats him single-handedly, showing a sense of progression that he's grown. And to most of the kids who loved him, who were little kids growing from teenagers, they had grown with him. And that's what meant to them. It showed the concept, instead of trying to be something you're not, use what you've learned from the mentors who have trusted you and apply it in your own way to be better. And honestly, that's what people liked about him. Next up is Knuckles, and he's actually a very special case. Unlike Tails, who has his own situation where he's trying to be like Sonic, he's actually more the opposite. While Sonic believes in living the way you want and being as free as the wind, Knuckles is completely a contrast and opposite to that, due to the fact that he was placed with an immense responsibility that he didn't ask for. In the beginning of Adventure 1, he generally questions why a responsibility that shouldn't even matter in his eyes was even placed upon him. But when Eggman seizes the emerald and destroys it, he decides to take it upon himself to deal with the major problem. You see, while Sonic represents freedom, Knuckles represents a sense of duty and responsibility, and understanding you can't just run away from your problems. At the end of the game, he understands why his life could have been different. He wouldn't have experienced the same situations or be with the people he cares about if it wasn't for the responsibility that he was put into, allowing him to view it with new eyes. And when he meets Sonic, instead of being mad at him, he's kind of like a close friend with him, and the three matter so much to this because their dynamic bounces off each other very evenly. So you're starting to get the picture. Sonic's inspiration inspired two people who were stuck in various one-dimensional spots to grow and progress as characters. And Sonic Heroes, or Sonic 2, or Sonic Adventure 2, to put it bluntly, basically excelled at this immensely. Tails is no longer a basic sidekick, but a partner and a protege. Knuckles takes his responsibility seriously, but understands that when there is danger, he cannot just run away from it or ignore it. And the balance between it worked really well. Sonic's the speed, and Tails is the intelligence and skill, and Knuckles is the muscle. And basically, each game overhauled their personality really well. Tails became so capable that he refurbished the Tornado into a battle mech, and used his ingenuity to help Sonic in his most dire situations. He even proceeded to make a fake Chaos Emerald, which you gotta stop and think about that. A gem powered to be rumored to be created by literal gods was replicated by an 8-year-old. And then you have Knuckles, which basically was originally very alone and isolated and had a naive sense of trusting anyone, is now precautious and has a stronger level-headed sense. He's not stupid, as many people want you to believe, but he's rather more brash and a little bit rambunctious. Also, he's an echidna. I need to explain that because a few game manuals specifically made the mistake of calling him a spiny anteater. So, to summarize the point to you, Sonic's inspiration, determination, sympathy, and needing to get serious, as well as being able to be calm in the most dire situations, inspires people to push forward and do better. And then there's Shadow. You see, Shadow's backstory, as well as his characterization, provided a dark and light elements to the story of the games. Shadow originally started out as a plain villain, an imposter who framed Sonic for a crime he didn't commit. And I kinda gotta explain a massive misconception with him as a small little breakpoint. You see, in the story of the game, Gunn immediately mistakes Shadow for Sonic, and many people speculated there was some form of prejudice or racism about it, but that was generally because Shadow's original design was made to look like an evil Sonic with the Japanese word terios, which it translates to reflection. But they later changed his design, but didn't choose to change the story plotline, so people were very confused and very annoyed when people just took one look at Sonic and assumed he was the bad guy when this guy is black and completely different and doesn't look a thing like it. It's also where the iconic Faker line came from. So, just a little tidbit there. Development history on the side. But genuinely, both his backstory and his personality led to a new era of Sonic, or originally the stories in the game. You see, Shadow stems from a place of loss of his closest friend and how the world views him as nothing more than a destructive force. Sonic later in the game shows him he could be better, and he later redeems himself. And that form of redemption is what led people to like him so much. He didn't try too hard to be edgy or cool, he just was by being there. And even though he had anti-hero-like tendencies, he was willing to help Sonic when things were bad and the chips were down. And both of them going super in Sonic Adventure 2 at the end led to one of the best games in Sonic history. Which is why Sonic Adventure 2 is still hailed as one of the most iconic and best Sonic games in the entire franchise. Oh. Right, Amy Rose. Now, anyone who's picked up a Genesis or a CD Master System or Mega Drive or whatever you call it probably knows about this character. And at first, they were put into Sonic CD as a simple love interest for the game, but because Yuji Naka felt that Sonic's free nature would go against that, they decided to make the relationship more one-sided, or that Amy was just someone who really liked Sonic, but Sonic didn't really care about on a intimate level, which generally is fine, and why I do see some people draw some weird stuff. Honestly, I think how the games are keeping it is rather a good way to go with. So a lot of the games just wrote her off as just a simp, more than the Spear Hero from Rising of the Shield Hero is. So, how did this game that basically overhauled every character from their normal one-dimensional state handle Amy Rose? Well, actually, in a really interesting way. The game basically started off with her acting how you would expect a one-dimensional sim character act, but then it slowly showed a sense of progression like with every other character, showing a sense of sympathy and kindness towards other people, even the most unlikely of characters, including E21 Gamma, which, if you remember from my Sonic Adventure era video I did back in part 2 or 3, you remember was a character who basically showed off Eggman's more hostile or cynical side. But this character being sympathized by Amy Rose, or showing a sense of kindness to them, inspired them to do the good that they did in the present. Which is why, generally, the character went from being a one-dimensional simp to being a character who shows genuine kindness to people and is a close friend to Sonic. So, with all that out of the way, what's the issue here? This seems to be a very easy pattern to follow, and you would think people who write these games would get a pretty good understanding, right? Unfortunately, no. Apparently, no. Because when the 2010s rolled around, two writers who were hired to write the games for the newer generation didn't understand that Sonic had a consistent story and characterization, and just assumed he was like Mario, whip, whop, and wahoo all the place. And this made everyone, and I mean everyone, pretty angry. And just as an example, let's just bring up Sonic Unleashed, because there was something I glossed over in that game that needs to be talked about. Oh, hey little buddy, what are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be talking about the games from the metaera? Sonic Unleashed is from the Dark Era on the Wii back during the 2010s or later 2010s. Why are you bringing this up? Well, I'm glad you asked, because this game is the first example of the writers by the names of Ken Pochan and Warden Garden, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering those names. You know, now I think about it, no, I'm not sorry. After literally screwing up an entire generation for the mascot of a franchise that people generally love, they don't deserve to have their names properly pronounced. I'm just going to outright say it. They basically screwed everything over. Allow me to give you an example, because Sonic Unleashed, it was the beginning of the end. So, remember how I brought up Tails' character development and how he went from being a one-dimensional sidekick who's scared of everything, is just a line of tech support, scared of being on the sidelines? Well, these two guys decided to throw that completely out the window. They made Tails a complete coward because halfway in Sonic Unleashed, when you meet the guy, he sees a bunch of aliens and is basically fleeing for his life out of terror and doesn't even try to do anything. And this was a very pitiful way to introduce the character, because a lot of people who still play Sonic games remembered Adventure 1 and 2. But they're monsters, I hear you say. He's an 8-year-old, I hear you say. What do you think that does to a kid like that, you're probably saying? It's perfectly natural for him to be scared. I mean, what else has he fought? Eggman was just a human with a bunch of machines. It's not like he's fought anything that was dangerous or borderline terrifying. Oh, really? What do you call this? This is Chaos, a water monster that was originally a being who protected the Master Emerald, but after seeing the greed in the echidnas, fought back. Tails had to fight this guy on multiple accounts of him transforming into multiple different monsters. And while he never fought perfect Chaos, he has plenty of experience dealing with this monstrosity. And you're probably thinking, alright, he's not that big. He's not that big of a deal, I hear you say. These other forms clearly must be more inferior, and why that is true, I want you to put this in perspective. You're an 8-year-old child whose only skills are engineering and a spin dash. And you're in a lake with a monster who is clear translucent, who can shapeshift into anything to kill you. And yet he handles this thing with no problem. But I hear you say, that's just a one-time circumstance. There's no way he's dealt with anything else this dangerous. Well, he's dealt with Metal Sonic multiple times. And then people are just going to take mental gymnastics and say, oh, what? He's just a robot copy of the mentor he's been following for years. It's not like this guy's going to pose any of a threat more than what he can deal with against Sonic. So what's the big whoop? Well, these two images you're seeing right now are his base and secondary form. Let me show you what this thing looks like when it gets a hold of a Master Emerald. You see this? This is the Metal Overlord form. And even though Tails wasn't fighting this thing solo, he at least would have done a decent fight if he did. This thing is so terrifying, and he had to deal with this with nothing more than his wits. He didn't have his mech transforming plane, he didn't have any Chaos Emeralds, he only had him, Sonic, and a bunch of skill with a spin dash and 2 tails. The fact he can even look this thing in the eye without getting scared, because let me remind you, this thing is insanely large, and this thing can fly. I mean, I want you to imagine that for a second. Also, he was doing this fight in the sky, so just put yourself in perspective. An 8-year-old was able to withstand fighting this. Yeah, just let that sink in for a moment. This 8-year-old had to put up with monsters and eldritch horrors beyond comprehension. So to tell me that a bunch of normal low-level enemies scare this guy off and he doesn't even try to put up a fight was one of the main reasons why these two writers were generally hated. They butchered what made this character's growth and expansion beyond being a one-dimensional sidekick so important. They nerfed him down to just some random plot device that directs Sonic where he's going because apparently Sonic's too dumb to understand technology. Like, seriously, what the heck? And you think it stops at him? Think again, because not even Knuckles was safe from these two. Basically, the writers decided to reduce Knuckles down to nothing more than a bumbling, chumbling idiot. Which is why a lot of people were excited for the movies and other things because people portrayed his character right. He doesn't think about things deeply, he doesn't care about his responsibility. Heck, sometimes the Master Emerald and his whole island plot is removed entirely. But honestly, he's just reduced down to a bumbling idiot. Punch first, ask questions later. And this made a lot of people unhappy because this was someone who genuinely represented a thought of responsibility and was something more, because a big misconception that these two writers left on people is that Knuckles is meant to be stupid and that he can't think really well. When in all honesty, he was only tricked by Eggman because of isolation and because of his moral standards, which he does think deeply on things and he does have philosophical moments with himself when he's all alone on a giant island. So for writers to butcher this made them really unhappy, and a lot of people were generally annoyed. And then came in Sonic. So remember how I said Sonic was generally someone who really had a sense of being genuine on top of being optimistic and sometimes serious when he needs to be? Yeah, all that is thrown away. The original voice actor was even thrown away. Not to dunk on Rogers, because honestly, he does a good job, and if he wanted to do a serious Sonic voice, he would, and I'll get into that later. But basically, these writers reduced Sonic down to just some middle-aged man who throws dumb quips like he's making fun of a kid. And while the games are genuinely good and debatable and a little bit divided, people really didn't like that Sonic's earnestness was thrown away in the place of self-deprecating humor. And this is one of the major things in media I will talk about later, but I feel like this is something that needs to be addressed. So you probably think after explaining that to you, we're done, right? There's no one else who ended up terribly bad on the character chopping block, right? Well, actually, no. Now, unlike the other characters, Shadow was reduced down to his bare minimum of what he actually is. Number one, his earnestness is removed, his backstory doesn't even matter anymore. He's just thrown down to the side as just an edgy stereotype. And it didn't help that his solo game basically propelled this even more, showing his personality at its worst. It just made him an edgelord or a dumb Vegeta clone, which is why a bunch of Dragon Ball fans constantly compare him to that and say he's nothing more than just a copy, even though his character is a lot more original and has a lot more respect than that stupid Saiyan Prince ever would. So, yeah, you get the picture by now. Every character's entire main writing, development, and arcs they had through the games were basically dunked on. And yeah, you pretty much know the short and sweet of this one. Amy was reduced down to being just a simp who likes Sonic multiple times and doesn't even care at all. It's honestly just sad. It was like this for most of the cast of characters until the point where they just decided, we don't need you anymore, get out. They just decided to throw away every character or just not have them appeared. They were allowed to be mentioned, they were allowed to make a cameo every now and then, but they were just there. There was no personality, there was no charm to it. They wouldn't say anything that was relevant to how they were. They were just hollow. And honestly, that's what made a lot of people upset by this. However, it's not too hopeless. Later on, after all these hits and misses of games, there was one person to basically fix this all, but not in the way you would expect. And while I would love to talk to you about how things today have changed those issues and have pressed this on forward, sadly I can't. Before you see the lights, you gotta go through the dark tunnel. The very very dark tunnel. So let's just get into it already, starting off with one of the biggest outliers to this issue. First up is Sonic Colors. Now, the game itself is generally fun, however, the overall story is pretty generic and doesn't really try to take as many leaps as the other games did. The story is pretty bare bones basic. Dr. Eggman, for no reason at all, woke up one day and decided to create an amusement park, which, to any Sonic fans, okay, that doesn't seem so out of the ordinary. He does that pretty normally, so what's the big deal? He decided to make it in space. And, for some reason, he decided to chain a bunch of random planets out of their respective systems and make them part of the theme park. And these planets are inhabited by aliens who are both a central mechanic to the game and also are the inhabitants of these said planets who are being captured and used as a power source. These are Wisp, and even though that name would make you think of some sort of spirit or ghost, they are nothing of the sort. They're aliens who have a special energy that can fuse with Sonic and basically become temporary power-ups, but instead of being the main gimmick, and why it is a little bit of a gimmicky thing, it does generally give the game a lot of flavor and character. Different Wisps can help you in different situations and can do some pretty cool stuff. The game itself had some cool platforming with them. The Laser Wisp can allow you to zip around areas, the Cube can turn you into a brick, Hover allows you to hover, Spike turns you into a literal buzzsaw, Black Hole, which is in a different game, exists. You have Frenzy, which turns you into a monster that chomps everything. You have Rocket, which shoots you with missile projecting speed. Drill, which allows you to dig under the earth, which also, if Sega wanted to patent it, they could sue Nintendo for using the drill mushroom later on, but Sega's not Nintendo, so just deal with that. But pretty much, why these characters were generally just stand-ins for Mario's power-ups, they were actually pretty cool. And honestly, I don't understand why so many people dunk on them. Like, you play any Sonic game with these Wisps and talk to a hardcore Sonic fan, they're just going to insult you for even liking these, which I find very rude and just unapologetic. I kind of like them, and realistically speaking, the fact that people just play these games casually and why the story isn't too good, they're really cool, and I like how they continued it for a few more games. Even the new Sonic Cross-World Racing is using them. And this is an unrelated note, and why I do like them. When I had a birthday themed around Sonic Colors, my mom actually didn't want to draw them on the cake because she thought they would scare away any young girls or little kids in the party, which honestly, looking back now, is a kind of a stupid thing to say. I mean, with the Black Hole and Frenzy Wisp, I can completely understand that, but the other ones look practically harmless. Plus, they generally are pacifistic, so you don't expect them to hurt you anytime soon, unless they want to. But despite that, the game is generally okay. The levels can get a little bit repetitive, and sometimes they ask a little too much of you when it comes from the red rings, but overall, they're pretty memorable. Some of the soundtracks are absolute bangers, which is a guarantee with any Sonic game as long as it's not Chronicles, and generally, overall, the plot is pretty good. From planet to planet, Sonic gathers, freeing the areas of Wisp from each planet, and eventually faces off against Eggman. Now, Super Sonic isn't really a big thing. It is something you can get if you basically play a weird multiplayer mini game and complete a bunch of stages by speed running them and getting an emerald. But that's more of a add-on than a requirement. However, it is a really cool thing, and getting Super Sonic through trial and error in an actual challenge will always be a rewarding experience. However, not everyone understands that issue. And overall, while the game did screw up with Tails and Sonic, it didn't ruin every character because, realistically speaking, not every character was there to be ruined. So, you think it's fine, right? Right? Well, no. The next game on the list is Sonic and the Lost World, which, while it is a really fun game and people are genuinely divided on it because people like to say it's just Sonic's attempt at Mario Galaxy, which I generally do not see it, the game is pretty interesting. And unlike its predecessor on the DS port, where it's just a 2D side-scroller, this game actually tries to be a 3D Sonic. And for a 3D Sonic on a handheld, it actually works. Granted, there are a few issues, and I do think some of the stuff in this game are pretty stupid. And it's okay. It's okay. But the thing that most people are divided on is the characterization with Tails. You see, the writers realized the backlash with how Tails was portrayed, so he actively tried to make him tech support or something worthwhile. However, they missed the point. Tails being smart was never an issue. And honestly, he never bragged about it. They just made him Hollywood smart. Basically, Tails would spit out a bunch of jargon, move the plot forward, or say something really annoyingly. And people defended this of him saying or questioning Sonic as him developing his own personality. Hey Dum Dum, go back to 2000 or 1990. You would know for a fact that he already had a personality. Like, he would argue with Sonic in some of the most rudest and annoying ways for no reason. And honestly, Sonic isn't much better either. When facing one of the members of the Deadly Six, he drops one of the biggest insults I've ever heard him ever say. He literally walks up to one of the members of the Deadly Six, which is the green character in the background, and when something happens, he insults him by saying, quote, "I'm sorry you have nothing more important to do with your life." That's not how he's supposed to talk. He's sure he can get angry at an opponent and throw some quips at them, but he's not gonna straight up insult someone like that. And Amy and Knuckles were reduced to background characters who barely showed up at all. They didn't even matter at all in the slightest, and they didn't even do anything. Which, honestly, was very annoying because they felt like in a situation where the entire mechanic of the game is that it has multi-gravital levels or areas, Knuckles' climbing ability would have been a really interesting concept, which was a massive missed opportunity that people decided to basically dunk. However, in this sea of annoyance and confusion, there was one game that did manage to get some fans of the older games interested, and it was in time for Sonic's 20th anniversary. Now, Sonic Generations is probably the only game in the entire meta-era that both old and new fans agree on because it comes from a common divide. You see, newer Sonic fans who were just ready to experience the series couldn't and didn't get to see any of the games that I mentioned prior. And honestly, I don't blame them. I mean, are you really going to spend your money on a console that existed several years ago that you don't even know exists? To a lot of younger kids, this was Sonic. Sonic's snarky and annoying personality, Tails being the Hollywood smart guy. That's what people thought Sonic was, which led to the massive divide. So this game itself was the main thing that brought those two people together or had an equal agreement on things. It's literally a cycle through Sonic's history. Every level, every interesting banger soundtrack, and every piece of art you could grab was there. The game was generally fun and had music to spare. You also got to play through both 2D stages and 3D stages, which honestly led to a lot of fun and generous things. I'm actually playing the game currently, and I enjoy it. And while Seaside Hill is giving me a bit of issues, I'm generally enjoying it. although getting that red ring is a real hassle. So, you would think this one game is the last one we're talking about. Well, no. You see, the overall plot of this game is pretty basic, but also is actually interesting. A monster known as a Time Eater, who shows up for no reason, has no significant relevance, basically tries to devour the sense of time and sucks all of Sonic's friends into different entries in Sonic's history. So, Sonic has to go through multiple accounts of his life in different time periods, from the classic games to the modern games. And Sonic's classic self is there to help him. And overall, the game, while it is fun, they still kept the annoying sense of humor. And another main issue is that I've only put the games out of order. You see, after Generations came Lost World, which really annoyed people, so it was like having this massively, really great movie being seen, and then watching something that was absolutely horrible. So, yeah. And the next Sonic game that came after this was just a basic racing game. So, how did this all end? Is this it? Is Sonic just another franchise that was a victim to irony poisoning? The idea that nothing could be serious and nothing could be interesting? Well, no. You see, one game was so bad, so annoying, so unanticipated, so uncared about, that it was basically the one bad event that would send Sonic back into his rightful direction. The Sonic game everyone loves to hate. Oh, and boy, do they hate it. I'm of course referring to the one game that basically was the Ragnarok that set this franchise back on a better course, Sonic Forces. Now, this might enrage you if I say this, but I actually like this game. Now, if I wanted to pick up a mainline Sonic game, I probably wouldn't play this. But if I just wanted to chillax and play a video game, yeah, I'll play this. But honestly, this game was like a tragic event in history that forced people to be stronger. I would say what the actual tragic event was, but I don't want to get demonetized, and honestly, I think it's kind of bad people still make jokes about it. But basically, every Sonic game I've brought up until then had divided fan base based off the topic of its gameplay and not its story. This, however, was a Sonic game that was so rushed, so unpolished, and so bad that it united both the old and new fans to basically unanimously say, yep, this is absolute trash. You see, the game showed Eggman having a little more resentment towards Sonic. This time, he wasn't backing down. And he basically created a special diamond called the Phantom Ruby, which allows him to create special illusions of hard light holograms with no light or mass. He used this to create an entire army of villains that Sonic had fought before. But he needed a vessel. He needed someone to withstand this power. Meanwhile, Shadow was pursuing a secret base during a massive crisis, and Eggman hired a mercenary group called Squad Jackal. Shadow, without any remorse, because let me remind you, this was when the two writers didn't understand that Shadow had more layers than just being edgy, basically murdered all of them. I am not joking. It is stated that they were all killed off one by this guy. And one of them basically fought Shadow out of remorse, desperation, and basically wanting to end this all. This is a man who literally took everything from him, and he wasn't backing down. And he basically failed. Shadow didn't kill him, but he sure didn't leave him alive at all. His mental state was basically broken down over this failure to save these comrades who mattered so much to him. He was vulnerable. He was broken. And Eggman took advantage of that. He basically took him through a super soldier process and gave him the ruby as a main weapon, making him his ultimate tool of destruction. After that, the war escalated quickly. Sonic ran to the rescue to fight back, but Infinite surprisingly defeated him with just a simple blow. From there, the whole world believed that Sonic had died, which you would think leads to a really interesting story concept, but no. Sonic's been tortured for 6 months, and he doesn't even show a sign of trauma. Why many people could forgive this because the E rating probably wouldn't show that, people know better. I mean, this is Sonic the Hedgehog we're talking about. This game was able to get away with an E rating, even though one of the games in the series literally showed a little girl getting gunned down by a military soldier. I don't think they just decided to do that for the sake of the game's rating. In all honesty, the game had a lot of wasted potential due to bringing back so many characters and failing simultaneously. The game has 3 different gameplay functions. You either cycle through playing as the avatar character of your own choice, which why it did revitalize the Sonic OC craze and did generally do some interesting stuff, and I hope that fans and other people renovate and fix what this could have been. There was also Classic Sonic, which his stages were generally too loose and weren't even well calibrated. And then Modern Sonic, which failed with the boost mechanics completely. Why this game has an interesting story, it failed in execution horribly. Each level was too easy, the soundtrack was too short, and the rankings were too easy to get. Also, there were no lives in the games, and realistically speaking, Super Sonic was blocked behind a DLC rather than being something you earn. I mean, there's no real point in even having it or using it because you can speed through levels without any issues. And honestly, it just led to this big escalation of the idea that Sonic couldn't be good anymore. So, in all this tragedy, in all this spite, how on earth did they manage to conquer this? How do they counter this? How do they fix such a colossal failure that so many people were anticipating would be the next Sonic generations that finally got it right, that flopped immensely? Well, that's where the comics come in. You see, while the games were failing left and right, the Sonic Archie comics, ran by a company that generally enjoyed the franchise back during its Sad AM years, had one writer at the helm who both respected the source material but also built upon it. That man's name was Ian Flynn. So, surprising absolutely no one after that major failure of Forces, Ian Flynn basically replaced the 2 writers who were fumbling every single game. Which is where we bring us today with one of the newest 3D Sonic games, and that is Sonic Frontiers. The game itself took a very interesting turn. Where other franchises would reboot, start from scratch, and not mention a word of its past failures, this game decided to do something unheard of. It decided to accept those failures, but also acknowledge all the games that came before and their consistencies. It decided, rather than suppressing their mistakes and moving on, acting like they never happened, it instead decided to learn from them and push forward. And I feel like that's a lesson people should learn from creating basic art, but also just in life. Rather than repressing your mistakes and acting like nothing happens and just staying in the same spot, learn from your mistakes and push past them. Push forward. And I know that sounds kind of cheesy coming from me, but that's kind of how Sonic's character stemmed back in the day. So, how did this game manage to fix 15 years of bad writing, bad characterization, and overall failure to create a character to rival the Mustache Man of Mario? Well, let me explain. The game begins with Sonic standing on top of the tornado like every other classic Sonic game. It seems the gang's all here, Tails, Knuckles, and Amy, searching for a new area where the Chaos Emeralds are located. Eggman is visiting a random island with some ancient secrets like every other older game. But this time it seems to have some sort of Matrix-like layer to it. So he creates a special AI known as Sage to protect him within the cyberspace. However, coincidentally, it gets him trapped. And at first, Eggman doesn't think much of it. Seeing this powerful world with ancient technology and power he can only fathom, he at first decides to look around and see what he can make of it. However, he later runs into ghosts or apparitions of gun soldier helicopters that try to kill him. However, it seems that the AI he's created has manifested in this space as a being able to not only control the cyberspace-like Matrix, but also protect him from its many defenses. However, with Sonic being on the island, it seems to have triggered a detection or a connection to a powerful monster known as the End. So, after escaping cyberspace, Sonic is told to collect the Chaos Emeralds, take down the Titans, and tear down the walls between two dimensions. Sonic, not understanding what the heck any of this means, decides to just go with it and go across different areas. So, how does this game execute this story? Well, for starters, Sonic exists within an open world. Rather than his levels being narrow hallways or just slightly open spaces, there's now entire island sections you can just roam across. Sonic actually has a combat system to him where the speed is used not just for running or doing homing attacks, but he actually has a variety of different attacks like punches or kicks, slices, or special attacks that only he can use. The game starts off with introducing Sonic's new sense of style and his personality, where he's sort of a mix between what we've been getting so far through recent years and what he was before. He still has a slight snarky attitude, but he still has his insight, his general earnestness, and his seriousness when needed. His friends are a trivial point to him, and he cares a lot about him. Upon meeting each character, Sonic basically sees that they're still stuck in between the digital space. However, in later areas, when Sonic interacts with them, they gain a sense of understanding of their inconsistencies and later relate to some of the beings who live on the islands, which are basically called Cocos, which look very similar to the Koroks from Breath of the Wild. Basically, each Coco in the game shares a very similar parallel to how Sonic's main cast has dealt with things. We see a young apprentice Coco to an inventor parallel how Tails' reaction and inconsistencies with Infinite were, so he decides to try to help him thanks to Sonic's insight in the past. We see Knuckles acknowledge his inconsistencies and come to the conclusion that he needs to go on and grow as a person, as well as understand things beyond more than just his destiny of the Master Emerald. And we see Amy grow beyond just being a simple simp and just understanding that they want to share empathy and some compassion with the world. Yeah, that sounds cheesy, but that's what some of the dialogue is. And maybe I'm not wording that properly because I generally hate the character, but that's just... However, this game managed to do something very different. Beyond all the Titan fights, Super Sonic 2, and all its interesting mechanics, it managed to do something that no one would have ever thought a Sonic game would actually do. Humanize Eggman. Now, why that might sound crazy to some of you, and why some of you might just see Eggman as just the bad guy, there were a lot of layers to him. He was both a character who was very funny and comedic, but also very sadistic and cold. And many people didn't believe this guy had anything other than looking out for himself and being an egotistical maniac. But to understand how this sudden change happened, you need to understand his family history. Luckily, if you've gotten the new Sonic X Shadow Generations game, you probably got that little special manual that explains some things, but anyways, I'm just gonna jump right into it. It all stems from Gerald Robotnik, Eggman's grandfather. You see, Eggman's grandfather had two sons, one who was an archaeologist and the other who had an intrigue for robotics. Yeah, you can basically take a guess who Eggman's related to. And Eggman generally looked up to his grandfather, how he was a renowned scientist who wanted to make a world a better place and wanted to do good for the world. However, when Gunn approached him about Project Shadow, he at first refused. And if you remember what I said from my adventure video, his situation with Maria and being taken aboard the Ark is what forced him in the position to take up the job. So, how does this contribute with Eggman? Well, you see, around the same time Maria's death or Maria's situation was happening, Eggman was generally neglected as a child, and generally his grandfather was being hated. His family often overlooked his intelligence and his skill because it reminded them of their grandfather, who had very questionable acts and generally someone they didn't like the fact that their son was looking up to them as a role model. Eggman was neglected as a kid, and if history has taught us anything about certain people who have worn mustaches, if you catch my drift, neglection and abuse is kind of what leads to evil. Eggman generally craves attention and validation. He wants to create his empire as a way to show off his intellect and science. And generally, before he met Sonic, he was a legitimate business and manufacturer. We know this because in the murder of Sonic the Hedgehog, he actually designed several trains that were used for normal transportation. Within Sonic Frontiers, you can secure Eggman memos, which basically explain certain lore factors about Eggman's past, as well as the fact that he felt overshadowed or unimportant to his family because of the situation and the attention that Maria had, even though she was never there. He never had a family or anyone who genuinely cared about him, and he felt overlooked and disappointed. You see, Gerald snapped and basically tried to kill everyone, mainly because the one person he sought to protect and because the family he had turned his back on him, and he lost everything. And after that event, it left Eggman neglected, alone, and in pain. However, the reverse happened when it came to one character, Sage. You see, that program that basically Eggman created manifests, and since Eggman couldn't be removed from cyberspace, he was kind of in a position where he couldn't rely on himself or focus on himself to get out of that area. He had to put his trust in someone else, which was not something he generally tried to do because Eggman doesn't care about teamwork. He doesn't try to cooperate with other people. So this was a very foreign territory from him. So, when the situation arises for Sonic to be stopped, he puts his trust in Sage to deal with the issue, and actually delivers pretty well. By being able to control some of the Titans, she basically nails Sonic down in one hit. However, unlike Infinite, where this was generally just a pawn being used for the heat of battle, this situation was more personal because this felt like someone he was taking pride in, showing and teaching them how to be. This felt like someone he had a connection with. You see, where Eggman was generally neglected and considered nothing despite his unique talents, he generally didn't choose to make the same mistake. He took pride in this. Rather than being egotistical and taking all the credit, he sees it in a way similar to being a mentor or, dare I say it, a proud father. Which is actually where the game decides to take things, where basically Sage sees Eggman as a father figure, which honestly makes sense, because he created them. However, instead of everything else where if it fails, he sees it as nothing more than the disposable tool, it's somebody he takes pride in. It's someone he cares about. And that kind of felt like something he needed, because why no one else gave him any support or any respect or kindness, he has the opportunity to do that. And that's kind of a weird shift that the game took. Because why every other Sonic character over the years was ruined, Eggman was always kept the same to a cold-hearted man who would instill his own creations with emotions just to torment them. So to see him have this shift and understand why he became this benevolent villain, it honestly made you feel for him. And in a world where a lot of villains who try to have sympathetic backstories fail, Eggman, being someone of both regret and pain, executes it in a very interesting way. Rather than acting like his egotistical self, he actually tries to help them and be supportive. Something you would never see this guy do. Now, does this mean that it's a reverse of what happened with Gerald, where having someone in his life that helps him and makes him realize that he can be something better means that he's going to be a good guy from now on? Oh, heck no! Eggman still is the bad guy because he sees this person as both a apprentice, a child, and also someone to help him take down Sonic because they know they're capable. And plus, realistically speaking, while he is a villain, it just grounded him more to be more humanized. They're still going to keep him as the main villain because the story still needs to be ongoing, which is where it brings me to an interesting stop. You see, how the story takes this is very interesting. At first, Sage is told to hate Sonic for the same one-dimensional reasons you might see Eggman hating. But over time, seeing him be insightful and inspiring to all his friends shows a sense of sympathy, and we start to see a level of kindness within this annoying character. Starting from telling Sonic to always leave, to being someone who's actually helpful and chooses to show a level of sympathy. Though that doesn't mean they're kind to Sonic. They're still mad at them, and they still genuinely see them as a threat and reckless. He sees everything he does as futile and doesn't understand that Sonic doesn't care about limits. He doesn't care about rules because he can always break them. He can push past whatever logic or the odds goes against it. And that's kind of the thing about his character. He was always someone who was free-spirited as the wind and was always willing to do the right thing no matter how bad the situation got. And that's kind of the type of hero archetype that people generally gravitate towards. So, this is where I need to get into the story. You see, the game has two separate endings depending on how Sonic deals with the main bad, the end, which looks like a giant purple moon, but also can turn into a massive monster. You see, depending on how Sonic decides to fight them, there are two different ways this can go. Sonic can either have his friends temporarily remove the cyber rebound or shrapnel that gets caught onto his body every time he breaks one of the cages so we can fight the end head on, or, better yet, he can obtain a special form of Supersonic that can actually assist him in a fight against the end. However, the only way it would work is but after running every possibility of what could happen, the only way that anyone survives is if, get this, Eggman helps Sonic. And the reason for this is quite simple. Because of how unlikely and how random this concept is, it opens a gateway for multiple possibilities of success. So, the game ends either two ways. Either you grind multiply hard to obtain Supersonic 2, which, if you're wanting a picture of what that super form looks like, here's a little something. Which, honestly, this looks insanely cool, and was the one time the Supersonic form decided to embrace the anime origin instead of being embarrassed by it. Which, honestly, is really cool. And it hyped the combat in a really interesting way. But also, there's the other ending, where basically the temporary shrapnel stuck to Sonic's body dissipates thanks to his friends, and he basically ends up fighting the end the same way. However, depending on what ending you get, you either see Eggman all alone with Sage sacrificing themselves at the last moment, dying with Eggman reaching out for the loss of his own child, or Sonic manages to defeat him and stands with them out of triumphs. Depending on which ending you get, it's not really confirmed which one is canon, but generally both hold a sense of emotional stake. However, the latter one I talked about earlier, the one where he's alone in despair, generally made people cry because this was one of the moments people didn't expect. They didn't expect Eggman to be anything more than a glorified villain, so to see him break down in sympathy is generally a touching moment. And so, you would think this game holds the biggest regard. Despite its bugginess and despite how the game can be a little bit repetitive, this was the massive turning point that fixed it. After Sonic Forces basically smacked it back in Sega's head that, hey, you made a mistake, you gotta fix it, they got the perfect writer to take in the best way. And if you thought Ian Flynn couldn't do it better by creating a story that's both highly cinematic and emotional, two things that Marvel can't even do, right? You would think that'd be the end of it. However, that's not the end of it. Not only did he manage to write a game that would give the characters closure, not only did they humanize Eggman, making him more than just an egotistical maniac, and not only did they introduce a new character who's honestly on the power scaling of something that I would regard in Dragon Ball or The Matrix, but he took it one step forward. So remember that game that I told you about earlier, Sonic Generations, the game that's both a collection of all the old games crammed into one and the newer ones that people were willing to agree upon? Well, what if I told you they took it a bit of a step forward? Watch this. Sonic X Shadow Generations. Now, apart from the title being questionable and raising a bunch of eyebrows that Sega had to fix Google searches so people didn't get stuff burned into their eyes like last time, this game became a massive overhaul. Ian Flynn decided to fix a game that people genuinely agreed upon and then build upon it, fixing some of the dialogue to fit the newer games to help create more consistent character writing, but also deciding to fix one of the biggest issues in the game. Or, say, games. You see, the X Generations with Shadow is more than just a very little novelty mod. You see, they decided to give Shadow, since he wasn't involved that much in the game, his own sense of closure. They gave him his very own campaign, and the game itself basically took everything that made Generations good and maxed it times 100. They gave his story closure with his backstory, as well as going through multiple different areas within the game that were both from Sonic Forces that got immediate overhauls. He had a slew of randomly cool and new abilities he got from Black Doom. He has his own special chaos control mechanics, which allows him to slow down time. And generally, the game managed to basically tell a new cinematic story involving Shadow and his past. It's also how I was able to bring up some of those random memos, as well as the journal that comes with a physical copy of the game. Both the Sonic and the Shadow part improved upon the game generally. You combined it with a game that was already good, and then you added a new game to it that was even better. Shadow's entire campaign stems around his perspective of Sonic Generations, and him coming to terms with his pain of his past. You see, because the Time Eater has been messing with, well, time, Black Doom, the very monster that forced Gerald to create him, or obligated with Gerald using his DNA to create Shadow, basically tries to persuade him or try to get him to his side. And throughout the game, people from his past, specifically Gerald and Maria, show back up. At first, seeing this potential, seeing this situation, he decides to try to fix the mistakes of the past. But it only ended up hurting him. Throughout various different stages, he fights Black Doom, multiple past enemies like Metal Overlord, Chaos, and various other fights like I just mentioned back on Tails' part, and generally gave the game a massive personal stake on his plot. Where Sonic's was very fun-loving and had a lot of action-packed stakes, Shadow's was more emotional and generally gut-wrenching to most people. People who enjoyed Shadow's backstory without all the overwhelming amount of angst generally loved this game. Not only that, but there was also a collab with the Sonic movie, which, get this, not only backs up the concept that the Sonic movie exists in a separate universe, but that Shadow went to that universe. Why Sonic and the gang in the third movie were all fighting Shadow somewhere else after he left Tokyo, Game Shadow was actually still roaming about. And honestly, the story was very cool. The point is, this mattered a lot. Not only did it fix the mistakes of the past, but it pushed on better for a brighter future, which leads us to where we are today. That led to the Renaissance era of Sonic, which is where we are today. Thanks to the overhaul from both Frontiers and X-Shadow Generations, Sonic is now back on top to how he's meant to be. Storytelling that's both light and dark, has earnest themes to it, and action-packed climactic scenes. And it all stemmed after one major publish of comic books. You see, how I said before that the comic books in Sonic, why they weren't canon, they did basically keep Sonic's character type very accurate. And these comics basically were the successor to Archie. They take place after the events of Sonic Forces, and honestly, they set a whole new stake for what could be. Not only introducing a brand new cast of characters that are slowly working their way into the games, but also fixing everything and writing the characters how they're meant to be. And I would know. And generally, it did a really good job creating spin-off stories for characters we thought were long gone, as well as creating new stories and new potential. And I would know. I own 3 collection copies that I got over time that my brother gave me as a gift. So, here we are today. After many years of failing, it's finally gotten back up. So, I hope you enjoy this video, and happy 35th anniversary, Sonic the Hedgehog. So next time you go out and get Sonic Crossworld Racing, I hope you can appreciate the love and care that was both put into the game and the overall story that's continued on. And as for Sega, well, you live and learn, if you know what I mean. And I hope you enjoy. Player Negative here. I hope you enjoyed that. Comment below what you think I should do a video next, like and subscribe. And don't forget, no matter how bad things get, no matter how many mistakes you get, you can push through. You can do the best that you can, and no matter how hard things get, you can do your best when you live and learn.